I saw my father for the last time on the afternoon of the 2nd of December, 1977. I was 8 years old. He had gone into the hospital for the second time in recent history, taken there from work because he had collapsed on the job. And I didn't know then, nobody else seemed to know, there was never any mention of it, but it's obvious now, after seeing other people, sick, that my father had congestive heart failure, is what was wrong. His legs were swollen up so big that there was fluid coming through the skin, and he couldn't breathe because he had emphysema, but the COPD was rampant by this time, and he was starting to fail. And but they were telling us, I think, at the time, that he had kidney failure. They were saying that as far as I can remember, that seemed to be what we were being told by the doctor, and that he was full of fluid because his kidneys weren't working. And it's obvious to me now that it was his heart was the problem, because he had an enlarged heart from trying to breathe, and like overworking as a child. His heart muscle was huge. It was 1.5 times the size it should be. And so yeah, he was in the hospital where I was born, St. Joseph's in London, Ontario. And me and Mother and Joe went to see him. So there he was in the hospital bed, and he was weak, and he had this transparent kind of green oxygen mask on, and he was talking to us, and we were talking to him. It was so close to Christmas, and he just loved Christmas. He passed that on to me. He was just infectious with his desire to celebrate the season. And so there he was, and he had this oxygen mask, and it kept coming off. He was trying to talk to us, but the elastic had kind of come out of the side of it, and he couldn't get it back together, and nobody was helping him. And so I crawled up on the edge of the bed, which was quite a feat because I was small, and this bed was a big high hospital bed with railings on it and everything. I got up in there and took the mask and fixed the elastic and put it back on his head, his face, and he looked at me, and he looked me right in the eyes, and he said, "What a smart boy." And he smiled, and his eyes were just brilliant, bright, burning in his face, like just the most just shining in his face, like, and clear. His eyes were so clear. And he smiled, and he patted me, and I had to get down off the bed because the doctor came in. Mahara, his name was. He was from Pakistan or India. I can't remember which one, but he was one of the first wave of Indonesian doctors that came into Canada in the 60s. These guys were good doctors. And they still are. Like I don't know why they excel at medicine. Probably because they need to over in their home countries. There's so many people, they need to have talented doctors. But these guys were, starting to come into the country in those days, and he was an older man himself. My father had even worked for him. My father had done renovations for him in the past. I think he even built one of his offices. And my father and him got along well. My mother of course, hated him because he was brown, and used to call him all kinds of racial slurs all the time. But they pulled me down off the bed when he came in, and he checked him over, listened to his chest, looked at his legs, and they were putting him on a liquid diet. I'm not sure how that would help somebody with kidney failure, but I don't know what I just don't know what went wrong with all that. If anything went wrong at all, or if there if there was any way to even save my father at that point. I'm not even sure there was, but so I remember my dad. The doctor was on his way up. My father looked over and said, "So do I have a chance? Do I have a chance?" Or no, he said, "Am I going to make it? Am I going to make it?" And the doctor looked over his shoulder and said, "Well, there's always a chance, Paul. There's always a chance," and walked out the door. So we didn't receive a lot of confidence from that, or at least I didn't. I don't know what my mother and Joe were thinking. I have no idea, but I remember going down the elevator, leaving the room, and I remember my mother saying, "Well, we'll be back tomorrow. We'll come back tomorrow." And we walked down the hallway, and I can still remember, like, those moments are so indelible in my memory that I still have a horrible fear of hospitals and doctors. I have what they call white coat hypertension. If I get around a doctor, one of my best friends is a doctor, and he's my doctor. And even with him, when I go to see him professionally, I am in a state of anxiety that's ridiculous. And I remember going down, looking at the floor, how the floor looked like stone, and it went up the wall about 8 or 9 inches, and then it had a lip, and the walls were yellow. And I get in the big stainless steel doors of the elevator, going down the elevator and looking at my brother and my mother, and they were real quiet, and there was something going on that I wasn't getting my head around. And we went home, and that was in the afternoon, and we had a tree up, if I'm not mistaken, by that time. And that night, just after dark, maybe 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening, I don't know where Joe was. Joe was possibly working. He had a couple different jobs in those years. He was a security guard for a lot of it. He worked for Burn Security and some other things like that. I think sometimes he was working shift work. And my mother and I were sitting in the living room watching Christmas shows. First one we watched was Rudolph, the original one, the one with Burl Ives, and that's sort of stop animation stuff, the classic show. Then after that, and it's weird because I don't think I've ever seen this program again. But there was this show about this donkey whose ears were too long, and nobody liked him. He was outcast because his ears drug the ground. And in the show, it was one of those ugly duckling themes. In the show, he ended up being the donkey that carried Mary to the stable where she had the baby. So the outcast donkey, became the hero. And 3/4 of the way through that half-hour program, the doorbell rang, which was really weird because we didn't have people visiting us, and the boys would just walk right in. And so the doorbell rang, and I stayed in the living room, and my mother went down the long hallway to the door because The door was at the opposite end of the townhouse from the living room. And I could see straight down at the door, and there was a chair. My mother kept a chair by the door to sit down so you could lace up winter boots. We had one of those, horrible chromium dinette sets in this townhouse. And there was a chair there. And I noticed when she opened the door, these two policemen walked in. And which really surprised me. I didn't know what was going on, neither did she. So I heard one of them say, "I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am." They said, "Are you Mrs. Cormier?" And she said, "Yes." And this officer looked at her and said, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but your husband has passed away." And if that chair hadn't been there, my mother would have hit the floor, because she literally just fell and landed in the chair, almost missed it, but landed in it. And I remember the police were just standing there. They didn't move to help her. They didn't touch her. It was just a weird scene, and they looked really uncomfortable. And my mother just started wailing. I'll never forget that. And she managed to get up, and she just started coming down the hallway, and she made it as far as me. I was standing there by the couch, and she made it as far as me, and she hit the couch and just fell on the couch, laid out, and was screaming and crying and screaming. And I didn't have a clue what just happened. I had no experience in death. I was smart enough to know that when people died on television and movies, they weren't really dead. I knew they were actors. And I had never had a pet die. I never had a pet, and at that point, and nobody around me had ever died. I knew people died, but I just didn't understand how it worked. And the policeman came down the hallway and was just standing there looking at my mother, me, and he looked at me. He said, "Is there anyone else in the house?" I said, "No." "Is there someone you can call?" I said, "Yes." And they gave their condolences again to get to my mother, and they left. So when my mother composed herself, which she never really did, but she never composed herself for the rest of her life. And she got on the phone to all the boys, called everybody, and Joe and Bob showed up. David was up in Thunder Bay, so he never even got to the funeral. And I think at this time there was something else going on with him that I'll get into later, why he couldn't make it. But yeah, so that moment completely altered my life path. It put us in poverty, for one thing. And it was really funny because my dad, who was frugal, to say the least, in the days after his death, we found money, cash money, hidden all over the house. My mother found $500 in his overcoat pocket. And she found, like, money. She found stashes of money everywhere. He didn't trust the banks. He was putting his money, hiding his money in his bedroom around the house, and I'm not sure. The funeral was quite expensive, and I think that most of the money we found around the house ended up paying for the funeral, which was at a funeral home in London, and there was no church involved. My father was not a religious man, and even though he was born Catholic in a Catholic, like a rabidly Catholic community, Shetty Camp, he told the story of how they left Shetty Camp, which was the parish priest came to the house one day when my mother, I don't even know if my mother was present, and he told my father, "Get your effing wife in my church on Sunday mornings or get the hell out of my parish." That's exactly what he said to my father. And because my mother was a Protestant and blonde and very, very white. And these, the French Acadians were a cloistered society, right? And highly Catholic. And they just didn't like outsiders, and she was one, and not French either. She couldn't speak a word of French. Like, everything was against her there. So my father told the priest to go screw himself, and threw him out of the house, and that's why they left Shetty Camp. They ended up packing up and leaving. So my father, even on his deathbed, apparently had thrown a priest out of his hospital room, and told him, you bastards threw me out of my own town because I married a Protestant, so get the hell out. And he cursed him up and down, threw him out of the room a few days before he died. And so it was a secular funeral. There was a minister of some kind there. I don't know what denomination he was, and it was a closed casket. My mother didn't want to see him in a casket, so there was a rather nice casket, and I remember there was a cross on the lid of the casket made out of salt. It poured salt on the casket in the shape of a cross. And there was just all these weird little things that my brother Joe looked at everybody going, I wonder if he's really in there. Those things stuck with me, and I was just sitting there totally confused, looking at that box, trying to figure out if my dad was in there. And I didn't cry a single tear during all of this. I never shed a tear. I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. I had no metric for a response to all of this happening. So it drastically changed the way I saw the world and looked at the world. It was in those actual days and times, I was unaware of how it was shaping me. But I remember, the funeral came and went, and Mother had given up. She was going to just do away with Christmas. Wasn't going to have Christmas, and Bob and Joe stepped in and said, no way that's going to happen. We're going to have Christmas for John, because he's just a kid. Don't be so goddamn foolish. And there was I'm pretty sure there was a group in the city that was much the same as Christmas Daddies is in Nova Scotia. It's a charity group that provides presents and turkeys and stuff to underprivileged families or families in distress. And they actually brought us a turkey and and a couple of gifts for me. I remember that happening, and it touched my heart. Even to this day, I've supported, and I still perform on that telethon every Christmas whenever I get a chance. I work with Christmas Daddies because they helped us, or the equivalent group in Ontario, London, Ontario, helped us. And so the boys ganged up and, just sort of forced my mother to go shopping and wrap things, and we had Christmas. And of course, being 8 years old, I was excited about Christmas, but I was diving into Christmas to avoid thinking about Dad. And it worked and it didn't. I don't know exactly. My feelings were mixed up, and just I was I couldn't process what had happened. I really couldn't. And they cremated my father, and they brought him home in a wooden urn and put him on top of the upright piano. And I used to sit and look at that wooden box and try to figure out, like, how did they fit a man as big as my father in that box? My father's on top of the piano, and he's nothing but ashes. It was a weird thing, and I don't even think now, at the age of 51, I'm aware of all the things that it did to my psyche, because my mother didn't deal with his death well. So I had no guidance, and my brothers were silent. They mourned in their own way and didn't really show any emotion that much about it. Just here and there. Bob was just devastated, and Joe just kind of, sucked it up, and he was going to be the man of the house because there was nobody else there. He was going to try to be the man of the house. But, he had his own life to live. He was the next son in line, right? Like after me, Bob was out on his own, married and whatnot. And so, yeah, it was a bizarre time. And it led to, I don't know, things spiraled out of control after that with my mother, and my relationship with my mother, and my relationship with the world. I guess the easiest way to describe it was, my mother kept me out of school basically from the 2nd of December until well into the end of January. I think legally we were allowed to. I was mourning the death of my father. Like, we were in rough shape, and my mother had no income. She never worked a day in her life except in the house, which is a job in itself at the level that she did it, because she was a clean freak and a cooking freak, and she worked her ass off her whole life to provide for her children. But she didn't. She was that way. She was a great mother, but she had no income, so she was dependent on my father's Canada pension. And that took a while to come in. So we spent a little bit there not really knowing how we were going to feed ourselves. And the boys were pitching in the best they could, but they had their own, like I said, they had their own lives to lead. And they always did the best they could for us. But my mother began drinking more than ever and taking more pills, Valiums and diazepam, and like all these really heavy narcotics, to deal with life. And it was the wrong way to deal with life, and that period led to a lot of things that I think I'm gonna save for next week's video, because some of them are actually funny. They weren't funny at the time, but the the sheer ridiculousness of how my mother approached everything and the unnecessary way she made everything an attack on her, like it started to present itself at that time where her paranoia and all the things that were wrong with her really started to come out in droves. Worse, I think, than she had been. And I was stuck with her alone. I was alone with this woman. My brothers had each other a lot of their childhood, and so they weren't alone in the abuse. So, but I was by myself, and I would end up spending the next 12 years or 13 years living alone with this woman who was not in her right mind. So, but on a bright note, and I'd like to end it on that, all of these things, in my opinion, drove me further down the rabbit hole of music. I started to look at things as a tribute to my dad. I wanted to make him proud wherever he ended up. I wanted to continue to impress my brothers, who were, they were worried about me because of who I was living with. And I was different. And as I grew older, I grew more and more different and aloof and, disassociated from people my own age and the world in general. I was completely immersed in playing and all the things that go along with that. And I was well read, and I, as I said earlier in these videos, I sought knowledge continually. But bottom line was, losing Dad pushed me further and further into that world, that escape I needed. And so it was a positive thing in that way. And I like to think that wherever he is, if he's somewhere, that he has been proud of the things I did in adversity. And I'm sure, I know for certain fact that my adversity is nothing compared to what some other people have gone through. I'm not the only person this happened to, but I want to talk about it, and it's part of my story. So I'm putting it in there because it's part of why I am who I am. And I think it's healthy to talk about those things and discuss them and face them, face what they were and what they did to you as a person, and how they made you look at things and look at other people and look at every situation in life. Because there are certain events in your life like that one that are incredibly traumatic, that don't happen to everyone, that alter the way you view the world and deal with people. And that was my first life experience and trauma that definitely shaped me as a musician and a person. So, and I'll talk about it more, because there's much more involved in it. What happened in the first 6 months after my dad died, would be a book in itself. But I will hit upon some of the most important stories out of there, and just say that if it wasn't for, at that time, Chet and that guitar I had, I might have lost my mind. But I had that to hide with and to heal myself for myself. And I think everybody needs something like that, whether it be music or whatever it might be. We all need it. And the guitar was mine. That was my tool of choice to get through probably one of the most difficult moments of my life.